welcome to episode 225 of the CRICKETher Weekly. We're going to start by talking about England v New Zealand. There's been 3 matches in the T20 series since we recorded our last episode. We've had a 9-over-a-side match that was then affected by DLS at the end, that was rain drenched, but we did manage to get some cricket in. England won that one by 23 runs. We then had a match at Canterbury where New Zealand actually decided that they were going to show up, which was nice of them. But ultimately England won in the final over after a bit of bish bash bosh from Freya Kemp. And then yesterday on Saturday at the Oval, it was unfortunately normal service resumes for New Zealand, who had another very bad batting collapse, and England won pretty easily. You don't see many easier T20 wins than that. There's one more match to go in the series at Lords on Wednesday, so we're going to leave the kind of proper post-mortem tearing apart the New Zealand structures and issues till next week's episode, Sid. So let's focus on England. There are obviously a lot of positives to come out of this series, one of which we kind of briefly touched on last week, is the kind of resurgence of Alice Capsey, who's now had a couple of good innings in this T20 series, on the back of not having played any domestic cricket, and then there being quite a lot of criticism of the way that she'd approached the ODI series. So yeah, Capsey, what's changed?
Well, I think that something has changed a little bit, and I think that it's really positive, because what's changed is that she's just started to hold off just that little bit that we all wanted her to do. So, it's the difference between the Capsey that goes out, in the WPL final and tries to, reverse ramp her first ball for 6, and the one that, that only tries to cut her first ball for 4. So what we don't want to do with her, obviously, is for her to kind of lose that aggression and that positivity, and that way she has a certain urgency about always trying to score runs, the way she's always trying to run a run, she's always trying to get back on strike. We don't want to lose that, but what we do want to lose was a bit of the absolute recklessness, which did lead to her occasionally, getting out in the way she did in that WPL final. Alice herself feels that she's taken quite a lot of criticism from the media and things, doesn't she, Raf?
Yeah, I think so. I think that she's definitely become aware of it, and she did the press conference after the match at Canterbury, and she actually said, "I've been under the spotlight for the past 3 years and it's taken its toll a little bit." That was how she put it. And I think, she did really kind of come into the public attention just at the age of 16. She's only 19 now, and that is a lot for somebody that young to cope with. She said that she'd taken a step back this year, and that the reason for not playing any domestic cricket was actually to go away and just have a total break from cricket for a few weeks. And that domestic cricket period was the only time that she could really do that, between coming back from New Zealand and then launching into the internationals at home. So she took that opportunity, and she said, "I just wanted to be normal and forget about being a professional cricketer for a couple of weeks."
So she was saying she went back to the farm, wasn't she? And her parents own a farm, of course, so she went back to the farm, walked her dog.
Hang out with the family, and see some friends and just catch up and just do normal 19-year-old things, because I guess that she would have missed out on a lot of that between the ages of 16 and 19. And of course, she's also earned more money already than most 19-year-olds could hope to earn in quite a long time. But it does sometimes come with its downsides, and there is enormous pressure. And people did say this to us a while ago, didn't they? And we said, well, we think that she can cope with it. She's got a good head on her shoulders. But Capsey's human, isn't she? And so
as far as we know, yes.
I think it's great that she's taken that time, and she's been able to, she now feels that she's kind of come back. And she also said that she's approaching things slightly differently, that she said, "I'm not listening to the outside noise as much. I'm focusing on what matters to me and trying to play the best cricket that I can for England, and that's the most important thing." And I totally agree. I mean, we've bigged her up and then had to unfortunately kind of be a little bit more critical recently, because that's the job of journalists ultimately. But that also means that as a player, you have to have a careful relationship with the media, don't you? I was just wondering whether there are lessons in this for other young players who are going to go through similar over the next few years. The obvious one is Davina Perrin, who isn't quite where Capsey was at the same age, but is certainly kind of on the path to stardom probably, and to international cricket sooner rather than later. what are the lessons for her from the way that Capsey has experienced life for the last few years. It would be great actually if the PCA could facilitate those two having a bit of a conversation, wouldn't it? And actually, what can Alice Capsey kind of pass on to that? I was going to say next generation. It's the same generation really, but that those people who are just a little bit younger than her, who are also going to be coming into this kind of media circus, which it is really now, and especially it was last summer with the Women's Ashes, and Capsey's now obviously playing in World Cups, playing in the WPL, which is huge kind of media spotlight on her.
Yeah, absolutely. I thought it was also really interesting that that England obviously are paying attention to the psychological side, because it's actually very similar to what we talked about with Lauren Bell, isn't it? So we talked about this last week. She's had a difference in approach come from she's trying to learn to kind of see each ball in the moment and to kind of reset and focus between each ball. It is important to understand those psychological aspects of cricket. So, and the way to work through that with players is to get them to understand it. So I think it's really positive that England are getting their young players to understand those psychological conditions, so they don't have to find them out for themselves over the next 10 years. Otherwise, it takes a really long time sometimes to do that. Yeah. So I think that good for England for putting the players in a situation where they can make those kind of psychological breakthroughs, which are often just as important as the game breakthroughs.
Yeah. Now, much as it's difficult to criticise England when they're so dominant against New Zealand, we're going to do it because that's what we do here on the CRICKETher Weekly. Proudly independent voices. Have England gone too far, Sid, with this experimenting ahead of the World Cup?
Well, that is an interesting question, isn't it? What we've seen several different team selections. Yeah. They've been all over the place selection wise, and they've justified it by going, well, we're experimenting with various different things that we need to do and that scenarios that we might crop up in the World Cup. So we've seen them play 4 spinners in one game, and then the really big one was we saw them take Knight out of the equation and go, what if Knight gets Delhi belly and is unavailable? And that's basically what Nat Sivers, I don't know if you use the phrase Delhi belly, but no. So what if Heather gets a stomach upset while we're at the World Cup? How are we going to deal with that? We're preparing for that. You have thoughts on this, Raf?
I do, and anyone who read my Guardian report will probably be aware of what my thoughts are. It seemed very strange to me. One of the reasons it seemed strange was because Heather Knight seems to have worked quite hard at not setting up a captaincy succession plan. So suddenly, with no captaincy succession plan and nobody who's kind of been briefed to follow her as captain, who's been brought in on the plans, because Nat Sivers is not in on the plans. She doesn't participate in selection. She doesn't have a say in that side of things. They're now throwing her in and going, well, what if you were randomly captain once? And that's just not a good replication of the potential situation that England might have to face. And also with Heather Knight sitting calmly on the balcony next to John Lewis, having a chat, watching everything unfold, being in and amongst it in the dressing room, being part of the warm-up. If Heather Knight suddenly does go down with a stomach bug ahead of a must-win World Cup game, what happened at Canterbury that evening does in no way replicate that. Okay, yeah, you don't get the same pressures. It's not the same because she's still in the group and she's still having a voice. And it also makes life very difficult for Nat Sivers, who's then essentially having to kind of carry the captain while the actual captain is sat up there on the balcony in view, watching your every move, having told you exactly what you're going to do and who you should bowl. And Nat did get in a muddle a couple of times.
Yeah, there was certainly at least one incident where 2 players thought they were both bowling the next over and they both walked up, and then they had to. The
ground announcer said Charlie Dean's coming on to bowl, and then they had to say, oh, actually no, I think it was Freya Kemp in the end. Very, very confusing for everybody. Obviously, England did manage to kind of pull the rabbit out of the hat in the final over, but it also just felt a little bit, to me, it just felt a little bit arrogant. They hadn't won the series yet at that point, and they were just going, we don't really respect New Zealand enough as an opponent to play a real 11. So yeah, I was uncomfortable with that, and as I say, I don't think it does anything to replicate what could happen in a World Cup if Heather Knight and maybe other members of the team went down with Delhi belly.
Yeah, and this is not the only place they've been experimenting, is it? Because we've seen the 4 spinners, we've seen the 3 spinners, we've seen different opening bowlers play in almost every match. often opening bowlers that are not really opening bowlers but are being used in that role because, like Nat Stiver herself, who's a very handy bowler but is not an international opening bowler. She's been doing that role. So the bowlers, the top of the batting order. We've seen several different opening partnerships, haven't we, Raf?
They've had 3 different opening combinations now in 4 matches of the series. Goodness knows what they're going to do in match 5. I think that John Lewis has created more headaches for himself than he's actually solved problems, because he's basically got 3 openers now. You've got Dunkley, who's back in, who's actually had a couple of decent knocks now with the bat. I know you said that she was batting very ugly at Canterbury, but she batted very well at the Oval.
Yep, it was much better.
And it was a great opening partnership with Danny Wyatt. Meanwhile, you've got Maya Boucher sitting on the sidelines, who's done absolutely nothing wrong and who's actually had a really good few months. The thing with opening partnerships is you want people to get used to batting together. You want them to know what it feels like for them to walk out to the middle so that they can do that in the World Cup with confidence. Well, the way to do that is not to keep chopping and changing, okay? And to have everybody, almost John Lewis's way of doing things seems to be to have everybody on their toes. They don't know what's happening next. They don't know whether they're going to get selected or not. They don't know whether they're in his thoughts. That seems to be his strategy this series, and I just don't agree with it, because I don't think that's a way to instill confidence in people, to make people feel that they belong in the team, and it's certainly not the way to kind of solidify opening partnerships, which is ultimately really important in T20 cricket, because we know that if you don't lose a wicket in the power play, that's often the key to winning the game, although New Zealand rather kind of went against that at the Oval on Saturday. So yeah, I think there's been a lot of indecision and a lot of experimentation that's being justified for the World Cup, and I don't really think that it's the right way to approach it.
Yeah, and meanwhile, there's been one big glaring issue where they haven't done any experimentation yet. There's still 1 match left in the series, so we might see a change at Lord's on Wednesday, is it?
Yep.
But, what about the wicketkeeper? Because, if Heather Knight can go down with a stomach upset, so can Amy Jones. And yet Bess Heath has been part of the squad. She's been, participating in warm-ups, but, we haven't seen her play as either a batter or as a wicketkeeper. So they're happy to experiment in some areas, but in other areas which are just as glaring, and the wicketkeeper is such a specialist position, and yet they've still got a reserve wicketkeeper that's never played an international game as a wicketkeeper, and isn't playing as a batter, presumably because they're trying to get other batters time in the middle. And that's fair enough, but you're saying you're experimenting, but then on this one, you're for some reason deciding not to experiment.
Yeah, I think that's really weird, because that is actually something where somebody would clearly benefit from, the reserve keeper would clearly benefit from having game time, because it's just as likely for Amy Jones to go down with Delhi Belly as it is for Heather Knight to. So yeah, I agree that that's one area where I would like to see them experiment a bit, but it's it seems to be one rule for one group of people and another rule for the wicketkeeper, and I don't really understand that. And I think if it did come to it, then unfortunately Bess Heath, the way it stands, would be really not very well prepared. Obviously your wicketkeeper also has to bat. And if somebody hasn't had very much time in the middle, particularly in international cricket, then that's going to be very difficult for them. Anyway, let's see what happens at Lord's. And as we say, we'll be doing a fuller post-mortem, particularly from a New Zealand perspective, in next week's episode. There is a bit more news this week, moving on to thinking about the domestic structure, about Tier 2 of Project Darwin and what that's going to look like come next year, 2025.
Yeah, we've had loads of questions over the past few weeks. People have written to us and tweeted us on social media saying, what does Tier 2 actually look like? Are the ECB doing anything even? Well, yeah, the ECB have been working very hard behind the scenes, and The Guardian have had an exclusive written by you, Raf. Tell us what Tier 2 is going to look like.
Yes. So, yeah, definitely much more information now in the public domain. There are some things that are kind of TBC. So the ECB haven't decided which counties are going to be in Tier 2 yet, although they do seem to have decided that the only counties who are going to be in Tier 2 are going to be first-class counties. More on that in a minute and our kind of views on that. We don't know exactly how many teams there are going to be, but it's going to be between 10 and 14. And that's kind of an interesting figure, because I don't know whether that figure was kind of come up with before they said we're actually going to whack an extra couple of teams into tier 1 come the next couple of years. So whether it starts off as being 14 and then goes down to 12, or I'm not 100% sure on that. In terms of how professional it is, tier 2 counties are not expected to pay players, but they are expected to hire a full-time coach, a part-time assistant coach, and a part-time S&C coach. So trying to professionalise the environment and the structures, while also recognising that the money that's coming from the ECB is not going to be adequate actually to pay players. In terms of the criteria, because I've actually seen the tier 2 document that was sent to everybody who was thinking about bidding for tier 2. In terms of the selection criteria, it was in some ways quite similar to tier 1. So there was a point about demonstrating passion and ambition. How are you going to create the high performance environment for players? For example, access to high quality coaching. Are you financially robust? So what do your plans kind of stack up financially? Your approach to governance and leadership. Creation of an appropriate geographic distribution of teams. So the ECB they said that with tier 1 as well, that they're concerned about that. So that's, for example, why both Kent and Surrey didn't get awarded a tier 1 team. So we're going to see something of that playing out in tier 2 as well. Also, interesting one, historic performances in ECB women's county competitions. Now, the handprint or the fingerprint of Beth Barrett-Wild is all over that particular criteria, but as it's played out, unfortunately, the ECB now seem to be moving away from that towards a model where it's all about your actual status, your historic first class status within men's cricket. But that was supposed to be one of the criteria. In terms of the application process, so unsuccessful tier 1 counties could just throw in their old application and go, please now consider this for tier 2. Anybody who hadn't bid for tier 1, so for example the national counties weren't eligible to bid for tier 1, had to then write a 2,000 word statement saying why they wanted to be awarded tier 2 status, how they were going to approach the creation of these kind of high performance environments, talking about what the structure was going to be around it, so how they were going to integrate the women's stuff within the broader kind of governance structures of the county, and then also an additional chart showing their proposed coaching support staff structure, and some annual financial projections as well. So it's quite a stringent process that they were asking counties to go through in order to bid for tier 2. Not quite as stringent as the tier 1, as you would expect, but it took counties who wanted to bid for this a long time to put these applications together. They worked really hard on them. And finally, I don't know if I mentioned this, but the winning teams are going to be announced on the 17th of July. So that's actually the same day as the Lord's game. So that's going to be interesting, whether that news is made public just ahead of that final T20, or whether the ECB wait until the next day, or they wait for the Telegraph to break it in an exclusive. Anyway, that's a bit more about tier 2. So I think we have got a bit more of an idea now about what it's going to look like and what the process has been.
Yeah, and as you say, the key thing here in terms of the way that things have played out is that yet again we have some very disappointed people, don't we? And in this case, the very disappointed people are the so-called national counties. Yeah. If you're not from England, just to explain briefly, the national counties are what used to be known as the minor counties. So that's the English counties that aren't part of the first class professional structure. We've got 18 professional first class counties, and then all of the other counties, like Berkshire where we live, are part of what was the minor counties, is now the national counties. The national counties were told that they could bid as part of this process, and we can see from the numbers that they were originally thinking of maybe as many as 14 teams being part of this. Therefore, that must have been set to include some national counties. Yeah. But it now looks like the national counties, at least initially, will miss out because the ECB have decided that they're going to prioritise the applications from the first class counties. So realistically, I mean, are we saying that it's probably going to be the rest of the first class counties that represent tier 2?
Yeah, basically that's it. So because we've got 8 teams initially in Tier 1, moving up to 10, and that leaves eight remaining first-class counties who are then going to be in Tier 2.
Yeah, and people like Berkshire, we know, are very disappointed, and I understand that that Berkshire are not part of that professional structure, but we keep hoping that we'll be able to kind of break out of those kind of the structures that kind of constrain the game from the men's perspective, because that's actually really kind of important, and it's something that the women's game is in a position to be able to do. One thing that's worth saying is that if you were, and we've said this before, if you were building a new cricket structure from scratch, you wouldn't do it in the way that it's currently being done. There are several reasons for that. You probably wouldn't have 18 entities. Another thing you wouldn't do is you wouldn't have loads of teams concentrated in the Midlands in particular, which are now some of the poorest areas of the country, and that's not where people are. There are cities there where there's been net negative population growth, and so to be able to build structures in counties like Berkshire, where there's been enormous growth and there's lots and lots of people that want to see cricket, would have been so fantastic. But unfortunately, that's not the way it's worked out. The kind of the history of the men's game has asserted itself, and the hierarchies of the men's game has asserted themselves. And it looks like that what we'll be seeing is a Tier 2 that kind of mirrors that men's county structure.
Yeah, I mean, a couple of points from me on this. I think first of all, the ECB moving the goalposts again halfway through the bidding process. They did it with Tier 1, with the Yorkshire thing, and also adding Glamorgan randomly, and now they're going about Tier 2 in exactly the same way. And what it does is it creates distrust, and it makes people feel very disenfranchised. If you said that you can be part of a process, and then actually once you've put in all of the effort, no, you can no longer be part of the process. So that's one thing, okay? Why put the national counties through all that if you weren't then going to even bother to judge their bids, which is what we understand is now happening? It makes me really cross, actually. ECB moving the goalposts again, unacceptable governance from what's meant to be a body who's just been through a process of review with the ISEC and has promised better governance. This is not better governance. Second point, what the ECB now seem to be doing is trying to push women's cricket and make it fit into a men's cricket shaped box. Okay, that's where we're at now, and that's ultimately where merged governance leads. It's exactly the same as we've seen with women's football. Your historic clubs that do well within the women's game, your Donny Bells, then get pushed out because it's all about where the money is in the men's game, when the men's association, when the men's governing body takes over. And that's exactly what we're now seeing in cricket, and it's really disappointing. It's disappointing because it means that all of that history, that distinctive history, that unique history that women's cricket has, is just being forgotten about. It's like it doesn't matter. And that's how the ECB are behaving. It
compels us to repeat the mistakes that are being made in the men's game. Yeah. We can't fix a lot of these things about cricket clubs being in the wrong places if you go, well, the women's ones have got to be in the same places as the men's ones.
Yeah, exactly. So, yeah, I'm a bit cross this week again, Sid.
Okay, well, it all comes down to governance. I think we might be revisiting this one at some point.
Anyway, thanks for tuning in, everybody, and we will see you in a week's time. Bye-bye.
Bye.